welcome to the newest episode in Dialogue Topics. I'm Taylor Petrie, editor of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. This season, we've been talking about the history of LDS scholarship on specific themes, exploring a topic in depth to consider how dialogue has been a forum for these important issues since its founding. We've also been bringing you up to date on these comprehensive collections of annotated scholarship, which can be found at dialoguejournal.com/topic pages, all one word, or navigate there from our homepage. You'll find amazing resources and research on tons of issues. And thank you for your sustaining support. This month, we're looking at the history of scholarship on the Book of Mormon. There was so much content on this that I had to break it up into 2 episodes. Part 1, in the last episode, covered from the founding of Dialogue until the 1990s, a key moment of real fissure in Book of Mormon scholarship, while Part 2 this month goes over the 2000s to the present. Thanks to everyone for following along on this history as a way of better understanding Book of Mormon scholarship. I want to alert you to one other resource that I discovered since the last episode. The Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, published by the Maxwell Institute, has their 2020 issue dedicated to the history of Book of Mormon scholarship. It's worth checking out. We concluded the last episode in the midst of the Book of Mormon wars. Scholarship had become more partisan, more factionalized, and more aggressive from some quarters. Dialogue had always been open to a variety of perspectives, but various factors had pushed Book of Mormon scholarship into different venues, with more apologetic approaches finding a home in farms, a well-funded effort that once dominated the market, and a more naturalistic approach showing up in signature books and some in dialogue. The year 2000 is a good place to start a new chapter. At the 2000 Sunstone Symposium, Brent Lee Metcalf, one of the main characters of the naturalistic approach, described the contemporary moment surrounding the Book of Mormon as, quote, a Galileo event. What he meant is that the evidence that had been presented against the historicity of the Book of Mormon was so compelling that the church would have to change its paradigm, much like Galileo challenged the geocentric model of the universe. Metcalf was overly optimistic, perhaps, that the Book of Mormon wars would have a significant impact on the church itself, but the issue certainly hasn't been resolved in the church more than 20 years later. Act 1. The Book of Mormon Wars continued. In the year 2000, we're still in the midst of the Book of Mormon Wars. These were about setting the context, whether ancient or modern, for understanding the Book of Mormon itself. Farms was still coming off of its height, but still quite active, and things were not calming down. First up in this new century is Douglas Salmon, Parallelomania and the Study of Latter-day Scripture, Confirmation, Coincidence, or the Collective Unconscious. This remains an important article. It goes right to the heart of things, how to explain the apparent similarities between ancient Near Eastern texts, cultures, and so on. This was a trend that we've talked about, really pioneered by Hugh Nibley, whose work is discussed a lot in this article, and continued by Farms, the foundation of ancient research in Mormon studies. The author, Salmon, makes the case that a rather careful methodological comparison is not actually happening here, but rather that this approach exhibits parallelomania. This means that they were overemphasizing similarities and deriving significance from that supposed similarity. Further, he argues that the parallels rely on extreme selectivity, misrepresentation, and more. He goes after a number of the most important examples up until that point. It remains one of the most significant challenges to Nibley's method up until then. It also contextualizes this approach in broader scholarship on the study of religion, showing connections in method to Eliade, Jung, and others. It's a fascinating article. While this one was respectful, if hard hitting and a challenge to the paradigm, not all of the articles coming out of this time period took that tone. Robert Patterson's article, Hebraicisms, Chiasmus, and Other Internal Evidence for Ancient Authorship in Green Eggs and Ham. Wow, this was a satirical take on the proofs of antiquity that had become commonplace in apologetic scholarship. When Jack Welch made the argument for chiasmus as an ancient Hebrew literary form in the Book of Mormon just a few decades before, it had remained at the center of the defense of ancient origins for the book. But over the ensuing decades, a number of challenges had arisen, including the fact that chiasmus was discovered in a variety of different modern texts as well. I am Sam. Sam I am. Voila, chiasmus. Patterson writes, upon an initial and cursory reading, the book appears to be a simple morality play. Zealous purveyor of unusual gustatory selection hawks his wares to an everyman, whose initial biases preclude his acceptance of the unfamiliar. By the end of the story, the everyman has overcome his baseless prejudices and rejoices in his newfound knowledge. The book made perfect bedtime reading for generations of youth known as the baby boomers. Deeper analysis, however, reveals that the book has complex subjects comprehensible only when the factual nature of its real authorship is known. Indeed, there is overwhelming evidence that the manuscript did not originate with Geisel, who fallaciously claimed credit for an archaic work that he or someone else surreptitiously translated from an ancient language into modern English. The tone continues like this, mimicking the seriousness of Book of Mormon literary devices and ancient Israelite themes, word print studies, and so on. It didn't add much to calming things down. In 2002, Earl Wonderly contributed his Critique of a Limited Geography for the Book of Mormon Events. Like the others, this goes after the farms model, this time the main thesis of John L. Sorensen. Sorensen had located the Book of Mormon events in a very specific context in Central America, identifying certain features like the narrow neck of land. It also suggests that not all Native Americans are descended from Lehi, rather, but a specific subset of people in this one small area. Wonderly says that lots of people had challenged this hypothesis on external empirical evidence, but Wonderly's article instead argues against the limited geography model on internal evidence of what the Book of Mormon says. This provides a good overview of the major arguments in scholarship and then critiques the limited geography model, suggesting that the hemispheric model best still fits the internal narrative of the Book of Mormon. In the same issue, Bob Rees wrote Joseph Smith, The Book of Mormon and the American Renaissance. Rees was the former editor of Dialogue, but was also a literature professor. He summarizes the debates over the Book of Mormon. Both groups, he says, find their own parallels. I've been labeled, he says, both an apologist and a naturalistic critic. I have watched the exchange with interest. He tries to offer a different way here. It's a good introduction to a lot of the scholarship up until that point, much that we haven't discussed. Like Osler and others, Rees was looking for a middle ground. Quote, the Book of Mormon may be genuinely both an ancient and modern text. There were real Nephites, but Joseph Smith translated the text into his 19th century mind. It's in 2002 that one of the most important studies of the Book of Mormon was published, not a dialogue. Terrell Given's book, By the Hand of Mormon, came out from Oxford University Press. It was a bit of a sensation, reviewed in the New York Review of Books, and really launched his career. This book summarized many of the debates, but sided more with the apologists. It's another great text that captures the era's assessment of the important Book of Mormon scholarship and the ongoing debates about its meaning. So after more than a decade of harsh attacks from apologists, sometimes we saw some pushback that was in bad taste, at least to me. But for the most part, we're seeing some solid contributions in the beginning of the 20th century that were attempting to clarify the issues, establish clear methodological standards, and offer compromised third-way approaches. And the field was professionalizing with more sophisticated analysis and rhetoric.
Hello, this is Andrew Hall, host of the Dialogue Book Report. Each episode features brilliant minds from the world of Mormon publishing. In our last episode, I sat down with music scholars Michael Hicks and Jake Johnson to discuss their recent work on Mormon music and theater. In the latest episode, I sit down with Terrell Gibbons to discuss the life and legacy of Eugene England. I'm also joined by my new co-host, Christina Rossetti, our nonfiction book editor at Dialogue. Subscribe to the Dialogue Journal podcast wherever you like to listen, and check out all of our past episodes by going to dialoguejournal.com.
Dialogue Podcast Network.